enriquecedor espacio que nos deja claros los retos que todos debemos enfrentar y las oportunidades que todos podemos disfrutar si logramos equidad de género. Hablemos de otros de los grandes retos para todas las organizaciones en materia de sostenibilidad: el cambio climático y el valor compartido con los grupos de interés. Le doy la bienvenida al señor John Elkington, referente mundial en sostenibilidad, quien recientemente lanzó el libro Green Swans o Cisnes Verdes, en el que aborda el concepto de capitalismo regenerativo y cambio hacia un sistema diseñado para servir a la prosperidad de las personas y del planeta. Bienvenido, señor Elkington. Adelante.
So thank you very much, Claudia, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be taking part in AES Week. Colombia happens to be one of my favorite countries, even though I've only been there once. I'm going to talk about a big shift in the global economy, and there are many shifts coming in the global economy. But in particular, I'm going to talk about the way in which people will increasingly talk about regeneration. And I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that. So just a quick word of background of the organization that I'm involved in, based in London, founded in 2008. The parent organizations from which the teams came were Sostenibility, a company I founded in 1987, and the World Economic Forum. We were the first B Corporation in the United Kingdom, and some of the organizations that we work with are shown there as well. But first, let me just say a little bit about why I think the way I do, and where I fit into the larger picture in a way. So I'm a baby boomer, so I'm 71 now. I've set up 4 social businesses, we would now call them, since 1978. They all still exist. The third one was Sostenibility. The fourth one is Volans Ventures. Over that time, I've served on now around 80 boards and advisory boards, and written 20 books. And the most recent of those 20 books is this one, Green Swans. And I just want to point you to the subtitle, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. And I'll explain that in just a second. But first, right at the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk about a new initiative we're setting up, the Green Swans Observatory, to track some of these extraordinary trends in different parts of the world. Now, when I published the book in April of last year, I think some people would have thought that regeneration theme was a little bit extraordinary. But in September of last year, Doug McMillon, who's the CEO of Walmart, the world's largest retail company, announced that Walmart would become a regenerative company. Now, I would have dismissed that as greenwashing if it hadn't been for the fact that I knew that the person who helped Doug McMillon put that speech together was Paul Hawken. And many of you will have heard of Paul and many of his books. This is the most recent book. It's not out yet. It's not published yet. It comes out in September. But the theme is regeneration, which for me is another signpost, another pointer to the fact that this theme is going to become very much more important over time. Let me just set this in a wider economic context. So Milton Friedman, extraordinary man, brilliant economist. His thinking has influenced business thinking over the last 50 years or so. Throughout that time, and I've been working now in the environmental and sustainability field since in the early 1970s, and we've seen the global environment continue to, in many ways, deteriorate. I've watched with people in boardrooms and C-suites around the world this sort of imagery. And then in 1991, I got a cartoonist from the Financial Times, Ingram Pin, to draw this cartoon for me. And the message was fairly simple. It was that over time in business, boards and corporate suites, the top teams and companies would need increasingly to bring voices in representing nature, and that's the fish, representing the social agenda, and we all know that the social agenda has become very much more complicated. For example, if you look at the United States, the Black Lives Matter campaign started there, but has spread to different parts of the world. And then on the right, a robot. And the robot was simply there to suggest that we needed to think longer term. But it was interesting, at least I was interested, in 2014, when the first robot was actually appointed to a board in Hong Kong. It was an expert system rather than a robot. But increasingly, I think boards are going to need help from very sophisticated computing systems like this. In 2018, through the Harvard Business Review, I then recalled a concept which was really symbolized by that cartoon. And the concept was the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. And I introduced that in 1994. So in 2018, I said, pretty much like an industrial product being recalled for improvement or servicing or whatever, we really needed to rethink the triple bottom line. First time that had ever been done with any management concept, the editors of the Harvard Business Review told me. But since then, we've been working on, if not that version of the triple bottom line, what should we be talking about? And I'll come on to that in just a moment. But within a few months of that review coming out, or that article coming out, and I'm not claiming agency, I'm not claiming that we caused this, we suddenly had a whole range of announcements. So, for example, this was the front cover of the Financial Times a few months later. We had people like Warren Buffett, Mark Benioff of Salesforce, major capitalists starting to talk about capitalism being broken or capitalism needing a reset. So I think what we're seeing here is the end of the era, so it's been about 50 plus years now, of Milton Friedman's predominant influence on business thinking. It doesn't mean it will end, and it doesn't mean that it's completely stupid. It wasn't. I mean, it brought many benefits, but increasingly we've got to think about other forms of value creation. And interestingly, in the New York Times, which was the newspaper that published Friedman's first, the business of businesses is to make a profit article 50 years previously, we had this full-page advertisement put in there by a coalition of 300 organizations from around the world, including my own organization, Volans. And what I'm not going to take you through all of these different posters and themes. I'm just going to point you in the middle of the bottom line at that green poster. And so regeneration was very much part of this emerging story. Now, I think we're in an extraordinary period in history. And as I said, I'm 71. I've lived through some extraordinary times. But my sense is the next decade is going to be outside any of our experience. And I think it's going to be very much an exponential period in our time. You see that partly when you see somebody like Greta explode into public consciousness, go and give talks to the World Economic Forum, to the United Nations, and so on. And I don't think that's an accident. I think citizens around the world are waking up to the need for change. They don't know who's going to do it. They don't know how it's going to be paid for. They don't know how long it's going to take. But Greta, I think, is playing into that increasing sense that something has got to change now. And in 2015, the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, were produced by the United Nations. And one of the things that we've been doing in recent years since then is working with companies while they played a very simple game, which was to say, what are we already doing? And how does that map into what we would be required to do to make some contribution to the global goals? And I think that's an understandable game to play. But what we keep saying to these leaders and to their businesses is the global goals are not an incremental change agenda. Instead, they're an exponential change agenda. If you just, as we say, if you just look at the first two goals, no poverty and zero hunger globally by 2030, those would be hyper exponential goals, even if we had any real chance of meeting many of them. I think we are making a lot of progress, but not nearly enough as yet to properly tackle these challenges. So I've been looking around the edges of this agenda and trying to see what might then be done. And one person who had a huge influence on me, and I'm sure on many of you, was Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Many of you will know he produced the book The Black Swan in 2007, just before the global financial crisis. So in many ways, people considered that to be a black swan. He's been asked time and again whether he thinks COVID-19 is a black swan, and his answer is consistently no, because people saw it coming. They saw pandemics coming. They saw coronavirus pandemics coming. They set up units to track these sorts of problems. They published reports, but pretty much all of that stuff was ignored. And in many ways, we're now doing that again with both the climate and the biodiversity emergencies. So for Taleb himself, a black swan was something that came completely from outside the current understanding of probability or likelihood. It was a complete surprise. It had an off-the-scale impact, and so certainly that's been true of COVID-19. And then afterwards, we tend to look back and think we've understood what's just happened to us and why, but very often we get that wrong, and the result is we set ourselves up to fail all over again. As I say, COVID-19, he thinks is not a black swan, but for me, COVID-19 is a demonstration of what happens when we do not understand the way systems are changing all around us. And this is part of our problem as a species, that this diagram, some of you will have seen advanced by Singularity University and other organizations. But the basic point is simple, that for a long time, exponential trajectories or trends are out of sight and therefore out of mind. And by the time they explode into reality, it's often too late. And our brains just are not configured for those sorts of possibilities. And yet in this decade, I think these sorts of trends are going to be very much more likely. Now, that's not just bad things. That's not just sort of black swan things like the climate change and space debris and antibiotic resistance and all of these bad things. We're also fascinated by some of the things that might go positively exponential. And so one of the things that we've been looking for is what we call ugly ducklings, solutions, initiatives, projects, technologies that would look very strange in today's world, just like the ugly duckling in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, but that over time would become something very much more interesting. So if I think about the electricity sector, to take just one example, and for ugly ducklings there, I think the idea of agrovoltaics or photovoltaics is a very interesting example where land is used for two purposes, both to produce solar electricity and to produce crops, so a double benefit from the same land. There are many, many other examples. Now, towards the conclusion, I'm going to talk through green swans, what they are, where we see examples of them in today's world, and what we can learn from them. So I'm not going to read the bullet point text on the right there. I'm just simply going to say that if I'm asked what a green swan is, for example, in the policy area, I would give two examples. The first would be the European Union's Green Deal, which last time I looked was worth 1.82 trillion euros. And the second example I would give would be the recovery plan in the United States. Some people call it the Green New Deal. And that, last time I looked, was about 1.9 trillion to $3 trillion. These are very big sums of money that are starting to be pushed into this space. And they're increasingly linked with priorities, social priorities like inclusion, and environmental priorities like decarbonization. Luckily, at the same time, and this is a green swan trajectory, technology is starting to behave in some rather extraordinary ways. Now, this diagram shows trends which many people will have seen in the past, and it's the falling cost, an exponentially falling cost of, in this case, solar energy. But you can see the same thing with wind energy, with battery technology, and so on. What's interesting about this is that over the time scale through which the Sustainable Development Goals will be a framework for change, what you see is solar technology becoming radically cheaper, even than power produced from existing, already built fossil fuel power stations. So this is an extraordinary disruption in energy markets. Now, it's very easy to think green swans are always going to be positive, but we all know that there are unintended consequences. So green swans have black feathers in the same way that black swans sometimes have green feathers. COVID-19, for example, was a huge boost for wildlife around the world. And this is one example of a black feather on a green swan, which is as the first generation and second generation of windmills come to the end of their useful lives, we're starting to have to think about what do we do with the propellers, the vanes? And the answer is we don't know. These things are not recyclable. People are talking about putting them up on end as telephone poles or whatever, but that's no sort of solution. And I think it's just a reminder of how we do need to think about unintended consequences sooner than we currently do. So this is a complicated looking diagram, but it makes a relatively simple point. We're coming to the end of an era. It's macroeconomic, it's geopolitical. It dates really in many respects from the Second World War, or the end of the Second World War, Bretton Woods, the Marshall Plan, initiatives like that, largely driven by the United States. That order, that world, that reality which we've all grown up in is starting to unravel. It's starting to fragment all around us. And we see bits of it, and we choose to sort of often close our eyes, but that is what is happening. That's bad news in some ways for anyone who's completely locked into that old reality. But it's good news in other ways, in the sense that it's only when an old order comes apart that new orders can really push through energetically. And I think that's what's going to happen. So the business agenda has largely, in the sustainability space, been defined as about responsibility. How can we be more transparent, more accountable, engage our stakeholders? All of that's great. And now we have issues around public access to healthcare, tax havens, wealth divides, these things all coming into the responsibility agenda. But at the same time, people are increasingly aware that our economies, our societies, the biosphere are increasingly wobbling. They're in trouble. And the only way in which we can support those vital systems is to regenerate them. And that's why, again, the regeneration agenda, I believe, is so important. And what does that mean for business? Well, one of the things it means is that we've got to pull through younger talent at every level as fast as we can. It doesn't mean we simply say, we screwed up. This is a problem or set of problems that we created. Now it's over to you young people to sort it out. This is a pan-generational challenge. We've all got to work together to make it, to roll out effective and timely solutions. And one example of a company that we worked with through all of last year is Acciona, the infrastructure and renewable energy company based in Madrid. And so we took 27 of their fast-track young executives, and we put them through a process through the full 12 months. And the original ambition was to develop a 5-year master plan for renewable energy and for sustainability. By the end of the process, and this shows the ambition of younger people, we developed a 10-year master plan for the company as a whole. And the company as a whole was committing to regeneration, not just the responsibility, and so on. So I think if you can bring younger people through, you both give them the experience they need, the confidence and skills that they will need, but also you sometimes end up with some very different answers to some of the problems that we all increasingly face. My last slide, and this is both a slightly dark slide and it's also a bright slide. And sometimes it's very easy in this space to say, you know, climate's going to collapse around us and the oceans are acidifying and the soils are disappearing. And all of that is true. But on the other hand, as a species, we tend to do our best work when we're backed into a corner. And now we sort of backed ourselves into what I almost think is the mother of all corners. So I think the next 15 to 20 years are going to see incredible innovation. And a lot of that innovation will not come automatically from the developed countries of the past. It will come from the edges of the current system. It'll come from places sometimes that we've never heard of, people we've never heard of. And one of the reasons why I'm fascinated to be talking to you today in Colombia is I am sure there are many things going on in your country which the world needs to know about. So I'm going to stop there and just say thank you to you all for your attention and hand back to Claudia.
John, it's been fascinating learning from you about this relevant concept of regenerative capitalism. Thank you for all that you have shared with us. I have a couple of questions, and before that, we have like 5 minutes, but I would say we all should read your book, Green Swans. John, you mentioned young people, what important is bringing young people to these conversations, but considering that most of the people that are running businesses nowadays are or have grown in this system, this particular and effective system of making money, how can we bring them to this new way of thinking in order to follow that you are proposing?
So, Claudia, you're completely right. And I'm not meaning to say that we should simply hand the challenge over to younger people. I think older people have to be brought into this as well. They need new skills. They need new information. They need to make new connections if they're going to continue to be relevant. And I'm not either saying that this is simply, we've all got to use the green swan language. That's simply about exponential progress. But there are agendas like the circular economy agenda, and there's the regenerative agriculture agenda. There are many different ways in which we can think about this. But for older people, I think the most important thing that they can do is get out more, which is a bit strange to say in the midst of a pandemic where people are often locked in their homes. But I think we've all got to get out more, and we've got to meet some of the people who are doing extraordinary and innovative new things and learn from them. And I've seen that work. I've seen that work with very major companies, with the top teams of those companies going out and suddenly seeing a reality which they perhaps read about, but not ever properly understood. So that would be one of my, I go with younger people because they see the world very differently.
Very important. John, what is the first step or the key step that a company interested in following this path you are proposing should be taken in order to, be in that path?
Well, many companies, and I look at AES and I see a company that is well down the track of addressing the renewable energy challenge for many different reasons. And I think a lot of companies could only dream of being in that sort of position. But for other companies, I think they've just got to think and then often rethink and understand that this is not simply about being nicer and better and a bit of philanthropy. This is about an existential challenge to our societies and to our economies and to capitalism And unless they can think of it in that way and start to read some of the right stuff, go and see, as I said, some of the right people, and pull in younger people with the right sort of perspective, they're going to risk their businesses in future. It doesn't mean that they should stop doing the responsibility work. It doesn't mean that they should stop doing energy efficiency or whatever, but they shouldn't be satisfied just to think, well, we've done that. We've saved a bit of energy. We've given some funding to these good groups. That's not going to be enough in what comes next. And I think the final point I would make is businesses are increasingly being expected to become political, to take political stands. And activists have tried to stop that for a very long time. And now they realize that unless business stands up and really starts to actively push for changes in the market rules, a lot of this stuff isn't going to happen soon enough.
John, it's been a pleasure to have you in AES Week Colombia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia.
Okay, have a good rest of the day. Con esta estimulante intervención termina nuestro AES Week Colombia. Ha sido un gusto contar con la participación de todos y todas ustedes. Esperemos que estos 2 días de charlas y de conferencias hayan sido constructivos para ustedes, tanto a nivel personal como profesional. Les invitamos a consultar nuestra página www.aescol.com, en la que encontrarán todo lo relacionado con soluciones de energía, sostenibilidad e iniciativas de AES para Colombia. En nombre de AES les deseo un muy buen resto de día y la invitación a que nos encontremos muy pronto. Hasta la próxima.